you, Mr. President. We will now take questions from citizens of the Republic.
President Madison, if you cast your eyes in the future, I have to identify myself as somebody who won a Fourth Amendment suit against the Central Intelligence Agency.
I commend you for your stature and your resilience.
Well, it took a while, but it didn't cost me any more than 3 tenured appointments. But my question goes back to the beginning. Your eloquent description of liberty, of the provisions in the Constitution, which made it impossible to keep, or should have made it impossible, to keep a standing army, to initiate and perpetuate wars without a broad national consensus. That is certainly true, but at the same time there was a paradox. There were internal wars. There was not alone, it was an internal war, a continuous internal war, a large-scale police action in the slave states to keep the slaves slaves. And there was a war of extension across the continent, involving at times the extirpation, at other times certainly the forcible brutalization of native peoples. And the interesting question is whether these internal wars, and I call them wars advisedly, they were certainly more than police actions, did not in the end have some corrupting effect and make international wars, i.e. the war against Mexico and so on, much easier to fit into our constitutional and political life.
Thank you.
That's a very insightful question. First, the observations underscore the fact that we at the founding had words too. You know, to err is human, to forgive is divine. For political purposes, we did have the 3/5 clause. And slavery was an abomination. To be true, I had slaves in my state as well, and they weren't emancipated at the time of my death in 1836. I've been reincarnated. But the Constitution did prohibit the slave trade, and moreover, it built into the system freedom of speech, the authority to amend the Constitution that ultimately led to an emancipation, which I certainly commend. But simply because there was a lack of perfection, a little bit of hypocrisy, even in the founding generation, doesn't mean that the underlying structure and principles were not sound. Now, if you talk about the wars against certainly a lack of freedom and justice for the slaves in the southern slave states and some of the expeditionary wars against the Indians, I do not believe that they were those who led or tempted the United States into these expeditions abroad. Because when I was president, what had happened in Central and South America was an eruption of revolts by colonies of Spain and Portugal against the home country. And there was no push at that time, even though it was very vulnerable colonial powers, for the United States to attempt to control, intervene in those particular affairs. Indeed, we didn't recognize the new nations until their home country recognized them. I think what you've pointed out is a different dynamic than the mentality of empire that came to sweep the United States of America. And I believe that mentality came after my death in 1836, when manifest destiny became the creed of the United States rather than liberty. Then we decided that we would rely upon force rather than imitation and example as our ability to influence things abroad. The glory of the country no longer was liberty or freedom, it was dominion and control. And that is something that came, I think, because the succeeding generations after the founding ones really didn't understand and appreciate those fundamental principles, which were, I say, unique in the annals of all human history. We don't understand how exceptional the founding generation was. The first time in more than 2,000 years, people thought up these ideas and acted upon them to create a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And of course, if we look at the results, despite some of those wrongs and errors, the system has operated to ameliorate those sins. And we now do have, and part of it's reflected in this audience, the kind of openness and equality under the law that would, in some sense, embarrass the founding fathers, whose rights were, in many respects, limited to white Anglo-Saxon Americans who were Protestants. That was an error, it was an imperfection in mankind. But it wasn't something that they didn't have the boldness to put in place with free speech, those dynamic forces that would ultimately eliminate those vestiges of feudalism that blighted our principles.
Good evening, Mr. President. Thank you so much for coming to share your insights with us and address some of our concerns and answer questions that we have. I have a two-part, perhaps a three-part question. Given that, back in your time, you and your fellows were most concerned with, two great risks to the Republic, and that was, standing armies and the big banks. And here we are, barely 225 years since you, crafted the final words of the Constitution and started the process of approving it. And we have both. We've realized both your greatest fears. Neither one of these, whether it be the Fed, in the case of the banks, or the standing army, are audited. So the people have no control over what's going on. In light of some of these other, incursions on our liberty that you mentioned earlier, whether it be FISA or the NDAA Act, would you agree that today, perhaps, the average American has less liberty, less freedom than Americans under King George? And that the only salvation we have is that document that you and your fellows crafted, the document that the current president says is old and tawdry and just a ragged piece of paper, but is indeed a living document because you included the ability to amend it. And over the years, even in your administration, you amended it, with the Bill of Rights and continuing amendments for many, many years. That this is the document that if we resort to that, if we go back to your founding principles and we, realize and admit that this is a living document, that this is what our country is founded on. This is what breathes liberty into the lives of Americans, that we can go forward and secure our liberties once more.
I think there may be two questions that I discerned in the presentation. In one respect, the President of the United States does command more authority in legal architecture over our liberties than King George III did. I think perhaps a political culture creates restraints, they're not legal restraints, that give us some more liberty. But in some respects, what I bequeath to you all in drafting the Constitution, and especially the Bill of Rights, it's my first act as a member of Congress, means that we still have the exhilarating liberty to be free. Because we can, with our votes, with our voice, and with our tenacity, recapture all of the authority surrendered to the president. And that is what we're about here today. We don't want to blame Caesar for acting like Caesar. We know what's going to happen with people in power. They crave more power. So what else is new? Like Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. But we have the ability today, with unity, with tenacity and principle, to capture all of our liberties back, which wasn't true with regard to King George III. We didn't even have any representation in Parliament at the time. So to that extent, we still have those liberties, if we will grab them. The second observation you made about the banks and the Federal Reserve System unaudited, there's certainly true that we, in drafting the Constitution, tried to place barriers into those creations. And it wasn't because we didn't understand that it's conceivable that the terrain that we operated on in 1787 might change, and we might need amendments to accommodate things that were unforeseen. In fact, that was the very first act that I was in Congress, as I told you. The Bill of Rights was what? An amendment to the Constitution. And I can guarantee you, nobody said, Mr. Madison, we don't need amendments. It's an organic, living, breathing document. It will sprout by itself, the Bill of Rights. We'll water it, and somebody who's some omniscient being will say, aha, now these Bill of Rights are there, even though they're unwritten. And indeed, even early on, when we had a wayward decision of the United States Supreme Court. Chisholm versus Georgia. It was overcome by an amendment, the 11th Amendment to the Constitution. Nobody said, well, this is just terrible. Judiciary gets it wrong. Why don't we summon the judges to the Congress and have Congress lecture them on how to decide cases, or just have the president ignore the case? We amended the Constitution. And so those who try to insinuate that somehow what I drafted was a petrified forest that will sit there after centuries pass and look totally antiquated simply don't know the document. That is what Article 5 is about, the amendment process. 27 times the document has been amended. And it's not always with the speed of glaciers. I remember even sitting in, I don't know, heaven or purgatory. This was when you had young people fighting in Vietnam, 18 years old, couldn't vote in state elections, and the Supreme Court declared in Oregon and Mitchell the federal government couldn't force the states to accept 18-year-olds to vote in state elections. That amendment, the 18-year-old voting rights amendment, was ratified in 13 weeks. So if there's a compelling need, the system is able to accommodate speed in amending the Constitution.